So, hello everyone. The title of this talk is intentionally a little bit cheeky, but really it's just basically a story of our journey of how we had a problem, we had some unique challenges, and we found a little known tool to help us solve it. And maybe you'll be able to use it sometime in your career as well. So my name is Nikas. I'm a tech lead at Hostmaker. We are a home rental management startup. We're based all over the world. The head office is in London, but we're remote first, so we're hiring pretty much everywhere. Our business is very centered around localized like city hubs. We've got a bunch of different cities that we run including Bangkok, Paris, Barcelona, London, and other European cities. After some time, we figured we had made it. We had survived long enough for a rewrite. And for a startup, that's a big deal. So we started our rewrite, and it had gone quite well. We had initially started like most other startups do with Rails. And then at some point, we've decided, hey, let's do like Node and JavaScript everywhere. So that's what we picked. We went through the entire rewrite quite successfully. But as of 6 months ago, there was one key part of our product lineup that was still running on the old legacy stack. And that was our main website. So it was obviously heavily used for marketing. The problem with it, it was slowish. It was showing its age. We had, of course, done a lot of things to try and mitigate this. Like we've done optimization sprints where we've tried manually optimizing the images that we serve, that sort of stuff. We even wrote like crazy Webpack configurations to do all of that, even plugins. But all of that meant that we also had a very, very slow build, upwards of like 30 minutes or so, which is very, very difficult to actually justify for a marketing website where you just want to change like 3 lines of code and then you spend the rest of the day just building and waiting for the builds to finish. Around 6 months ago, we also had a unique opportunity in that the business wanted finally a brand refresh. And all of that meant really that we were able to get away with a rewrite. So we knew we wanted that. And then we thought about some of the challenges that we had at the time. So I mentioned that we're running in a bunch of different cities. That's actually 9 cities at this point. Each of those also have a country hub. So it's about 6 country hubs. All of those pages are running about 2 languages each. So that's English plus the local language. And we have around 15 routes or pages or however you want to call it. We also had a bunch of dynamically generated content. So that's translations, localization stuff, dynamic content from Cosmic and like careers pages on Greenhouse. And all of that basically meant that we were going to have around 1,500 unique pages with unique URLs and unique content, and they're all going to be different. In addition to that, we also had to support SEO very well. Since we're a local-oriented business, all of our SEO had to work across all locales perfectly. We also were very interested in getting a better page speed. As I mentioned, our original website was showing its age. So we wanted to kind of not have to load all of that content on the fly and just like keep the user waiting. And we also knew that it would be difficult to tell to the business, hey, we're just going to go away for 3 months, and then 3 months later, you're going to get something, or not. That's the usual way it goes. So we didn't want to do a big rewrite where we just kind of go away and hide for a while. So to sum up, we were basically looking for something that was React-based. As I mentioned, all of our other products were now running basically React and Node, so we didn't want to stray from that. We also wanted it to be flexible, so it had to integrate with our code base, since we knew we were not going to replace all of it at once, and it had to run in like side by side with our regular code for a while. We also, since we had done that migration, when startups start and you've got a Rails stack, you've got people who are working there. Some of those people were still working with us. So we didn't want to like overwhelm them with even more new stuff like GraphQL or something like that. And we also knew we didn't want to have to rewrite everything again in half a year. So we wanted something that would work for us long term. And so we set out looking for solutions. And we had a few inspirations for that. So the first, who here has a GitHub Pages site? There's quite a few. I mean, pretty much everyone knows that this is a good way to host your website. It's free, it's very easy. And those who have tried it, they know that it's super easy to actually get your page live. So you basically run a build process and everything's there, and you just like git push and it's live running on your website. And at that time when we were writing, deciding which tools to use, Gatsby was also very popular. So you know those newsletters where you have like 15 of them coming in every day or so? That was all over the news there. So we decided, hey, why not use a static site generator? Where it's a landing page, it's got marketing stuff, but it's mostly static content. Maybe we can do it. So we started looking at the landscape of static site generators. This is a graph of GitHub stars, the most important popularity metric when it comes to technology. And obviously we were only looking at React stuff, as I mentioned before. So we started looking at like these two, the biggest ones. So the first one up was Next.js. It's actually like the second most popular static site generator that I could find. And it had a one key advantage. We were actually already using it for one of our other products. So the other product was like our own in-house Airbnb clone, which we still run. It's using Next.js. It's been live for, I don't know, a year now probably. And it's working quite well. And while originally Next.js was just like a server-side framework for rendering isomorphic JavaScript applications, at some point they added support for next export. I didn't mean to rhyme that, but which meant that you could pre-build your applications and just kind of serve all of that static content without having a server at all. So it was a great framework. It was very well documented. It had a large community, and those were all like really good things. But when I mentioned that we used it, and when we used it, we found a few key problems with it. So for us, we felt that it was more of a framework than just like a library, and that proved to be kind of a breaking point. It also had too much of a predefined structure for us. So basically in Next.js you have to put all of your files in a certain folder structure, and that meant that it would be difficult to integrate with our existing code base because you would have to like kind of move everything, shuffle everything around, and that's not something we wanted. And we also found it very slow and difficult to optimize because it's such a complicated framework. It's basically server-side and client-side rendering, and there's different lifecycle methods. They change scope, and you can't use everything. Like it's just it was difficult. So we decided to keep looking, and looking back at our scoreboard, it only really ticked one of the boxes for us. So the next one up that we looked at was Gatsby. It's slightly less used, less popular than Next.js, but it's still all over the news. And essentially, it's basically the de facto static site generator for React now. So that's what the big boys use, and that's what gets all the news around it. When we were evaluating it, it definitely looked like a very fast and very powerful framework. It's definitely very well documented. It's got a huge community. But remember that thing where I mentioned that we didn't want to overload our people with like new technology, like GraphQL? Well, Gatsby is basically GraphQL or bust. So you have to know GraphQL. It's everywhere. You also have to either hope that there's a plugin for your use case, or you will have to write a plugin yourself, which seemed like too much of a hassle for us to really be into it. So if we go back to our scoreboard, it was definitely React-based. It was definitely very flexible and could satisfy pretty much all our needs. And it would work long-term. But the simplicity of it, like the lack of simplicity of it, was really not working for us. So at this point, we had two clear options. Both of them were popular, but both of them weren't quite what we were looking for. And so we started looking at the less popular ones. So React Static is basically a static site generator. It claims to be fast, lightweight, and powerful. And its main premise is that it's the power of Gatsby without the complexity of it. And so we initially, like these are bold claims, it's not easy to be as powerful as Gatsby without having all of that stuff around it. So when we were to really figure out whether it was the one for us, we started looking through the documentation. And back when we were still looking at Gatsby, we were kind of searching how, we will have dynamic content, so we'll want to generate pages from it. And we started looking how to do that in Gatsby. And section 7 of the manual, it's not really documentation, it's a manual at this point. And it just like keeps on going and scrolling and all that. And it just seemed very, very difficult. Meanwhile, in React Static, it was just, hey, look, there's this one function. Return whatever you like. It's going to be like routes from there. Have fun. And that really proved refreshingly simple for us. So all of that simplicity is everywhere in React Static. So take your like standard JavaScript project structure. There's only two things you really have to care about with React Static when you're starting out with it. That's two files. That's the static config.js and the app.js. And I'll go over each of them in turn, but I'll start with static config.js. So that's the file you have to define when you want to say which routes you're going to render. And the idea here is we basically return an object, and that object has one very special property that's getRoutes, and that's basically your entry point where you just kind of list all of the routes. And it's an asynchronous function. So if it's got promises or you need to fetch some data from somewhere, you can do that there as well. So it's very, very simple. Well, at least compared to that like long list of things you need to do to load data dynamically into GraphQL. This also gives us a lot of power because it's not only that you can load the data dynamically, you can also load your pages dynamically and just generate them on the fly. So here's an example of where, if you've got different cities and different languages, you can basically generate a route for each of those combinations, and it's just as simple as looping over and mapping them, which really, really, really looked nice to us. So now that you've got all of your routes in your static config.js, you need to get them into your app somehow. And the way React Static does it exports like a build time dependency for you, where you just import your routes through there, and then you just use it in your application. It's basically a wrapper around React Router, so you can also use dynamic routes in there. And it just works like you expect it would. So you have all of your pre-built static routes, which get generated by React Static, but you can also add your own like dynamic content. So for us, it was the sign-up flow where it was all very user-dependent, and we couldn't really pre-build it. So yeah, looking back at our scoreboard, it pretty much ticked all the boxes. So it was definitely React-based. It was extremely flexible because you only had 2 entry points, and apart from that, you could pick and choose where you put everything. You didn't have to change like the folder structure to make it work, and it didn't have to have like a specific build, server running or something like that we didn't want to support. It was extremely, extremely simple, and we figured that it would last us long term. Precisely because of that simplicity. So it was difficult. It was easy to as long as you implement it in your function, you would have to implement it yourself. But you could also always add stuff like caching and different fetching strategies, and hey, promise all instead of just iterating through all of the promises and that sort of stuff. So there was one downside to this, though. When you have libraries that are this popular, it's a little bit scary to pick something that's this far down the line. And of course, this is like I'm not showing the entire thing. I've done the presentation once before, and I had a guy come up to me, like, why didn't you use this library, which had like 500 stars, etc. And I'm like, we didn't go that far, but maybe that's the one that someone else will do a talk about in a few months. How about React Static is shit, and you should use that instead. But yeah. We decided that worst case scenario, we're just gonna kill everything, move to Gatsby, and then no one got fired for building on Gatsby. So we went with it. We rebuilt our website. The entire initial launch took about 1 month across a few developers. And That included 3 or 4 pages for the initial launch. It also included the entire sign-up flow, which was a pretty difficult thing to implement because it meant rewriting everything in that part. But overall, we were fairly happy. So I'll talk about what went well first. So the first thing that went very well, it proved definitely to be very customizable. So we were able to integrate everything with our existing code base without any issues. We were actually able to add other stuff that we've been using in other projects, such as CSS modules for separating and having a sane styling workflow. That also used Sass for building the styles. We were loading our images with ImageX, which dynamically compressed and optimized all of our images, so we didn't have to manually optimize all of that. We also had a bunch of dynamic content and translations, and all of that was just one tiny custom Webpack config away. So that definitely worked for us. It was also a great development experience. So of course, everyone supports hot reloading now, so that's not a big deal. But things didn't go wrong very often, and when things did go wrong, the logging proved quite good actually. So it had all of the necessary information there, and basically most of the time it was us doing something stupid and the framework just saying, hey, you did something stupid, so go fix it. And that was really nice. It also had a great performance out of the box. So to this day, we haven't gone through an optimization cycle on our new rewrite, and it's still working very well. It's working faster than the old website has without spending time on it. And the best part about it is that we still have a huge amount of time we can shave off by just optimizing everything we can. So we can add stuff like code splitting and dynamic loading, and that won't be difficult at all because React Static will help us there. But most importantly, it basically did everything it had to. So when we initially launched, we started with about 500 pre-built pages. So all of those had dynamic, unique content in them. And now we are up to 1,500, and it's still going without any problems whatsoever, and we don't foresee any. So we're now loading data from about 12 endpoints at build time, and all of that's basically just a 3-minute build time for React Static specifically. So I had a person ask me what do you do with how do you deal with partial builds and that sort of stuff. I mean, I said to him, it's 3 minutes, it's okay, we can survive that. So I think at least for the next half year, we're not going to rewrite this again, which is a good thing. Of course, there were a few things that didn't go very well. So the first thing is you remember that slide I showed you back when I was comparing it to Gatsby. The documentation is everywhere. Is like that everywhere. It's refreshingly Spartan. So it's got everything that you need, but it's just very terse, and it's not written out in detail, and you don't have a bunch of different examples and that sort of stuff. Of course, it's only JavaScript, and the framework itself is not that difficult to understand if you look at the code, and we've had to many times. So that there's ways around it, but it's definitely something that if you run into problems, you're gonna go into the GitHub repo and just kind of browse the issues and see what other people are facing as well. I think the main takeaway that we had from this is even though there's no server-side rendering here, strictly speaking, there's still a build step which is run using Node. And that meant that you couldn't always use the obvious solution. So there were times if you're dealing with local storage and that sort of stuff, if any one of you has ever written a server-side rendered or isomorphic JavaScript app, you know that there's stuff you can't use local storage and cookies, and it's kind of tricky to know where that separation is. So you have to keep it in mind. And that leads us to our main kind of lesson learned, and that is to always stay in React land. So I'll illustrate this with an example. So I mentioned before many times that we are running a very localized site, and it's got different stuff there for different languages and cities. So we have a requirement where we need to, all over the app globally, get the current locale that we would be rendering with. And that's either what the user has selected or where we're pre-building it or stuff like that. So it's one of the most important parts of our application. That's where we've had the most issues with. So the first thing we did was, of course, let's just do a service. It's a utility, it's just, let's parse the URL and just return the current locale from that. And that actually worked very well in development. And it also worked very well in QA, because people were looking at it and it's, hey, everything's all right. Like the cities I'm changing languages, that the content is how it's supposed to be. But the problem is it didn't work when pre-building it. And another problem is that we only found out about this a couple of weeks after launching in production. So for a few weeks, all of our pages looked okay to any of our users, but to a robot, it looked like it was still using all of the defaults for those locales and for those city changes. So that was difficult to actually find out. So we thought, hey, we have this data. It needs to be available globally. It's basically we need to be able to inject it using props because it's used in all of our components. And we can also pass data through our routes. And we can also get that data elsewhere. So at that time, React 16 had just launched, and that launched with it React Context. So who here has heard of that? Okay, that's not all of you, but it's really good. If you ever get the chance, it's basically replaced everything for us at this point. But we thought, hey, let's use that. So that's what we did. We converted all of our localization data to be passed in through the routes function, through the get routes function, and we basically then injected that using what React Static gave us, which is the route data provider. And we basically just put a bunch of these providers, all with our static content there. And then in our application everywhere, we just built a tiny little higher order component, which would then just inject the localization parameters that we wanted for that. And that worked perfectly fine. So from that point onwards, we didn't really have any more problems with localization. There weren't any more mismatches between the build and the runtime. And that really proved to us that we could depend on providers, and we started using providers in context in all of our other projects as well. So we're now rewriting another one, and that's basically used to be written in Redux, and we're slowly moving away from Redux and migrating everything to providers, which really simplifies the entire code base. So that was a really good takeaway for us. And speaking of context, so when researching for this talk, I kind of looked at, hey, other people must be doing this too, right? It's not just us, obviously. I mean, using static site generators in production for real-world applications, not just blogs. And then I found out about the JAMstack, which basically stands for a non-technology specific stack. So it's across all different technology stacks. There's Go-based ones, etc. It's basically just the idea that, hey, let's have our JavaScript provide the dynamic content in our application. Let's have reusable APIs, which would give us the data. And let's have some pre-built markup, which will then, during build time, will compile all of that into servable content. And there are a few benefits to that. So the first one is we have all the static files in the build process. Once that's done, so we can just put them, on a CDN, like AWS or just basically whatever you're using. And it also meant that it's blazing fast and easy to make it so. So if you need scaling, you just, just add more CDN, just put it on there. It's cheap. There's also no waiting for content because it's all pre-rendered on the build process, and you don't have to have loading screens and that sort of stuff because it's immediately visible to the browser, and then it hooks up to the online dynamic JavaScript framework that you have. But most important to me personally is that it's a great development experience. So I mentioned GitHub pages, and that's kind of part of it. If you want to upload your own personal blog, it's basically just git push once the build is done, and it's there live in like 3 minutes. And it's free, which is the best part about everything. There's also other services like Netlify and like a billion others, which I won't mention because I don't remember them. But they're all free, they're all easy to use, and they're all like pretty much ushering in the new version of the web. And another important thing is that so when things go wrong, it's easy to reproduce it, because you have your stuff online somewhere and the build has gone, like maybe in your, I don't know, Jenkins or whatever. But you can run that locally and you'll get that same data and you'll get the same basically output, and you can just look at it and see what's wrong and why it's not working, and you can debug it. I think that's really, really powerful in this day and age. So like all of that is cool, but it's not just us that's doing it. Just to prove, give more proof that it makes sense and it's a bit of a trend. So you might have heard of a small website called Smashing Magazine. So they had gone through a similar process about a year before us. So it's March 2017. And they had great success. So their site is actually much, much, much more massive than ours, and all of their blog articles and like all of the pagination, all of the dynamic content, all of that is running and being generated on build. It's running on Hugo, which is a Go-based static site generator, and they're having a pretty good time with it, from what I can see. So yeah, to summarize. You remember this slide where the promise of React Static was the power of Gatsby without the complexity of it. And to us, that definitely proved to be correct. And me personally, I think I'll definitely, so I've used React Static actually after that, and the entire journey that we went through with Hostmaker, that was a really good impetus for that. And it's just, it keeps on working, and I like it. So static site generators don't have to be hard. And of course, be sure to check out the live demo at hostmaker.com/careers. And thank you. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
So, what part of it is exactly static and which part is dynamic? Because in my perspective, static sites are basically 100% static. They contain no JavaScript or something, no dynamic elements.
Mm-hmm.
And when you are using React and changing that amount of application, you will inevitably be having large chunks of JavaScript which run after the page is loaded into the client's browser. So it's only a pre-rendered part, which is like static, and you are running JavaScript and React, all the things after that, or there's more which gets transformed into a static list.
So you basically, during build time, all of your JavaScript runs and all of your React code runs. So whatever the props you pass through the get browse function as data, that will all be used to then just generate the initial load. Now, when you have all of that, it'll basically be a static file, and it's got DOM, it's like regular divs, etc. It's basically the first render of the React application. So all of that gets shipped immediately. And then there's a bootstrap, so it does hook in the dynamic JavaScript if you have any. If you don't, it just doesn't, there's nothing to do, so it just kind of keeps the initial render that you had on the first thing. If you have dynamic routes, so for us this was the sign-up flow, where it's all rendered on the client side. So there's no, you just basically send the index. There's no pre-built HTML for that, because all of that depends on the user. We have sessions, etc. So you can mix and match those on a route level, and even on a, you always have a component did mount for React where you can hook in your dynamic stuff that will get loaded after the first render. So it's kind of both. So you have both the static and the dynamic running side by side.
It's more like a React pre-rendered?
Yeah, it's basically pre-rendering everything. But you can technically serve that immediately and it's going to work. If you don't have any dynamic content and you serve that, it's going to work because it's just HTML at that point. Thank you. Yeah.
So where did the content for your pages, where did it lie? Was it some directories of static HTML files, markdown files? Was it in the database? Because that kind of...
Yeah. So our content, I mentioned that we're loading from 12 different endpoints. A lot of that is Cosmic.js, which is like a content management system. It's API based, so you just can get stuff from there, and it's got HTML templates in there, and you can, there's like what you see is what you get, editors and that sort of stuff. So that's for the marketing people. We have a good chunk of our content coming from Greenhouse. So that just provides a regular REST API, and we just call that and show the content there. At this point, we don't have like markdown files or anything like that, because that requires too much like developer involvement. But you can also load it from the file system, because it's just like the static config.js is running on Node, and it's just like a regular node. So whatever you can just load files, iterate through them, and just like format them into content. What else? We also have it calling, I think, our API as well, which is like our in-house API. So there's like authentication there and that sort of stuff. So it's very, very flexible in that term. Yeah. I think that's it. Thank you.